It was the second week of October when the first sign of trouble appeared, though at the time it seemed small enough to brush aside. The days were growing shorter, the evenings cooler, and the faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. On this particular Tuesday morning, the quiet of Maplewood Lane was broken only by the sound of fallen leaves skittering along the pavement. The neighborhood was still waking up when I stepped outside, coffee in hand, to check the mailbox. Tucked between a stack of coupons and an electricity bill was a single, crisp envelope. It wasn't just the stark white of the paper that caught my attention. It was the bold, blocky red letters stamped on the front, HOA notice. The words carried a kind of authority that made the pit of my stomach tighten. I stood there on the driveway, steam from my mug curling into the cool air, and slid a finger under the flap. The paper inside was thicker than usual, the kind that crinkled sharply when unfolded. At the top was the familiar Maplewood Homeowners Association letterhead, its neat serif font trying to disguise the bureaucratic weight it carried. My eyes scanned the first few lines, and with each sentence, my brow furrowed deeper. They were demanding I take down my holiday decorations in October. Not in December, not after the season had passed, but right now, weeks before Halloween, Thanksgiving, or any reasonable start to the festive months. The letter claimed I was in violation of a newly enforced no early decorations clause, allegedly added to the community guidelines earlier in the year. According to them, holiday lights, inflatables, or any other seasonal adornment could not be displayed until a strict 2 weeks before the associated holiday. I read the paragraph twice to make sure I understood. This wasn't about a burnt-out string of lights or a messy yard display. It was about the soft strands of white fairy lights draped along my front porch railing. Lights I'd put up months ago, not just for the holidays, but to bring a little warmth to the house year-round. To me, they weren't even decorations in the holiday sense. They were ambience. But to the HOA, apparently, they were a violation worthy of official notice. The letter gave me 10 days to comply or face escalating fines, starting at $50 per day. It even ended with the hollow courtesy of, "Thank you for your prompt attention to this matter." I could have shrugged it off, quietly removed the lights, and gone about my business. But as I stood there on the driveway, the pale October sun catching the corners of the paper, something in me hardened. This wasn't just about lights. It was about control. About an HOA that had slowly been tightening its grip over the neighborhood in ways that went beyond reasonable upkeep. This was the same group that had once measured the height of grass in people's yards, sent warnings over unsightly basketball hoops, and banned certain paint colors for being too bold. For years, I'd played along, paid the dues, followed the rules, kept my lawn neat and hedges trimmed. But this was absurd. And deep down, I knew that if I caved now, I'd be giving them permission to keep pushing further. I looked back at the house. The lights were barely visible in the daylight, just a faint glimmer along the railing. At night, though, they bathed the porch in a warm, inviting glow. Friends and neighbors had often commented on how cheerful it looked, how it gave the street a touch of charm. It wasn't hurting anyone, yet here I was, being threatened with fines over it. That evening, as dusk settled in, I made a point to plug in the lights. Their soft golden hue spilled out onto the lawn, casting gentle shadows over the fallen leaves. As I stood in the yard, I noticed curtains shifting in a nearby window. Someone was watching. I already had a suspicion who it was, Mrs. Lane, the HOA president herself. She lived 2 houses down, in a meticulously maintained beige 2-story with flower beds that looked like they'd been arranged by a professional landscaper. She was the type who kept a clipboard in her kitchen and a list of infractions in her head at all times. Sure enough, the next morning brought another envelope. This one hand-delivered and slipped under my front door. Inside was a terser, almost smugly worded reminder of the deadline, along with a note that compliance is expected of all residents, without exception. The tone wasn't just authoritative, it was personal. I set the note aside and opened my laptop. If they were going to quote bylaws at me, I was going to read those bylaws for myself. I pulled up the Maplewood HOA's official rules, scrolling through page after page of small print. There it was, a clause about seasonal decorations, but it was vague. It said nothing about a 2-week limit. Instead, it merely recommended that holiday-specific decor be timely and seasonally appropriate. It was open to interpretation, which meant their so-called new enforcement wasn't just nitpicking, it was likely unenforceable. By the time I closed the document, a plan was already forming. If they wanted me to take down my lights because they were too early, I would make sure they stayed up, and not just for one holiday, for every holiday, year-round. What they didn't seem to realize was that my brother was a lawyer. He'd handled HOA disputes before and knew exactly where the legal lines were drawn. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one, and I'd make sure it was perfectly within the law. That night, as the wind rattled the last of the season's dry leaves, I sat in the living room, looking out at the golden glow of my porch lights. This was no longer about decoration. This was about standing up to a petty kind of power, the kind that thrived on compliance through quiet annoyance. The HOA had made their first move. Now it was my turn. The morning after my decision, the neighborhood looked as peaceful as ever. Maplewood Lane had that early autumn charm you might see on a postcard. Amber leaves clinging stubbornly to branches, a few pumpkins starting to appear on porches, and a crisp, clear sky that promised sweater weather. But beneath that calm exterior, a quiet tension had taken root. At least for me. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of nerves, but because I wanted to start. The plan had come together in my head overnight, sharpening with each hour. If the HOA wanted to treat my modest string of porch lights as some grand violation, then I was going to give them something worth talking about. Something so over the top and yet so perfectly within the bounds of the law that they wouldn't be able to touch it. By mid-morning, I had a list. The first phase of my counterstrike was simple. Turn October into a full-blown fall festival. The porch lights would stay, but they'd now be joined by garlands of artificial autumn leaves, bales of hay stacked neatly on either side of the walkway, and carved wooden signs with hand-painted phrases about gratitude and harvests. I wasn't breaking any rules. There was nothing in the HOA guidelines banning seasonal decor. And if they tried to call it holiday-related, they'd have to explain which holiday they thought welcome autumn banners violated. I made several trips to the local home improvement store and craft shop, my trunk filling with warm-tone decorations, faux pumpkins, and strands of orange and yellow LED lights. By early afternoon, the front of my house glowed with the colors of October. The original white fairy lights blended seamlessly into the new display, no longer the lone offense they had once been accused of. It didn't take long for the watchers to appear. Mrs. Lane, the HOA president, emerged from her beige fortress in a fitted cardigan, clipboard in hand, strolling at a pace that suggested she was just out for a casual walk. But her eyes lingered too long on my porch, her pen tapping against the board in subtle disapproval. A few other neighbors glanced curiously as they passed, some hiding smiles, others avoiding eye contact. Inside, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. By the next evening, the display had grown. A tall wooden scarecrow stood guard near the mailbox, its burlap smile both cheerful and, perhaps, faintly mocking. A wreath of autumn leaves hung on the front door. Every time I stepped outside, I caught sight of passing cars slowing down just a little to take it all in. The house had become a point of interest, a splash of seasonal color against the otherwise uniform row of manicured lawns and neutral siding. Then came the second letter. It was slipped under my door again, the HOA's preferred method when they wanted to send a message quickly and quietly. This time, the language was sharper. They requested that I remove any decorations that could be construed as holiday-related, reiterating their supposed 2-week rule. But buried in the wording was their problem. They couldn't define what counted as a holiday decoration without stretching the meaning to absurd lengths. They had no legal standing to tell me I couldn't have pumpkins or autumn leaves in October. I left the letter on the counter, unopened after that first skim, and went back outside. This was exactly the kind of overreach I had anticipated. And the more they pushed, the more I knew I could push back, all while staying squarely within the guidelines. The following week, Phase 2 began. This wasn't just about making a point for October. It was about setting the stage for a year-round transformation. I started sketching plans for November, December, and beyond, a rotating cycle of seasonal ambience that would never leave the house bare. I wasn't going to just keep the lights. I was going to make them part of an ever-changing display that honored every season, every minor holiday, every excuse to decorate. Arbor Day, I'd have trees. Valentine's Day, hearts in every window. The 4th of July, red, white, and blue across the lawn. I also called my brother. His response was immediate and confident. He knew exactly how these disputes played out, and he assured me the HOA didn't have a legal leg to stand on unless they could prove the decorations caused measurable harm or violated a specific, clearly worded bylaw, which they couldn't. He even suggested I keep a folder of all their letters, dated and photographed, just in case things escalated. And they would escalate. I could already feel it. One chilly evening, as I adjusted the garland on the porch, I caught sight of Mrs. Lane again. This time, she wasn't pretending to be out for a walk. She stood at the edge of her driveway, phone in hand, snapping a picture of my house. The flash went off twice before she disappeared inside. It was almost funny how much effort she was willing to put into documenting a row of plastic pumpkins and a string of warm lights. But I knew those pictures were heading straight to the HOA's next meeting. And if they thought sending me another letter would scare me into taking it all down, they were about to be very disappointed. Because the real display, the one that would cement this little neighborhood skirmish into legend, hadn't even started yet. November arrived with a chill in the air and the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys up and down Maplewood Lane. Most of the neighborhood had traded Halloween pumpkins for bare porches, waiting until mid-month to tentatively introduce their Thanksgiving touches. My house, however, skipped the waiting entirely. The transition happened overnight, as if a stage crew had descended under the cover of darkness to set the scene for Act 2. The hay bales and scarecrow were still there, but now they shared the space with oversized turkeys, cornucopias spilling with artificial gourds, and banners declaring gratitude in bold autumn lettering. The porch lights, still the original warm white strands that had started this whole feud, were now intertwined with strings of orange and amber bulbs, washing the front of the house in a glow that could be seen from halfway down the street. Every detail was intentional. The decor wasn't haphazard or messy. It was coordinated, tasteful, and entirely inoffensive to anyone who wasn't looking for a reason to be offended. And that was the key. The HOA could hate it, but they couldn't prove it broke a single rule. Word of my display began to spread beyond Maplewood Lane. A few neighbors, the quiet dissenters who'd had their own run-ins with HOA pettiness, started stopping by on their evening walks. They'd linger at the sidewalk, taking in the transformation, smiling like they were in on a private joke. Someone posted a picture of the house on the community Facebook page with the caption, "Maplewood's got the spirit this year." The comments section split almost immediately, half praising the creativity, the other half clutching their pearls over decorations out of season. I knew which side Mrs. Lane fell on. I spotted her again one afternoon, pacing slowly at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin, white line. She was taking notes. I didn't need to guess what her next move would be. Sure enough, 2 days later, another letter appeared. This one wasn't a simple notice. It was an official cease and desist warning. The HOA claimed my lights were in flagrant violation of the 2-week holiday rule and accused me of setting a disruptive precedent for the neighborhood. The tone had shifted from passive-aggressive to outright aggressive. They weren't just asking me to take down the lights anymore. They were threatening fines and legal action. I read it twice, then placed it neatly in the growing folder of HOA correspondence. My brother had told me to expect this escalation. The vagueness of their bylaw was their weakness, and the more they pushed, the more they exposed just how flimsy their case was. By mid-November, the local paper had caught wind of the situation. A reporter reached out, curious about the neighborhood holiday feud that was stirring so much chatter online. I gave them the facts. No embellishment, no dramatics, just the truth about a homeowner keeping their porch lights on and decorating for the season. The article ran a few days later under the headline, "The House That Refuses to Go Dark." If Mrs. Lane was furious before, the publicity sent her into a quiet rage. I could tell by the way she avoided making eye contact whenever we crossed paths. But she wasn't done fighting. December arrived, and with it came phase 3, the moment I stopped holding back. If my fall displays had been spirited, my winter display was a full-scale production. White icicle lights draped from the roofline, wreaths adorned every window, and a pair of life-size nutcrackers stood guard at the front door. I brought in a professional decorator to set up synchronized light patterns that pulsed to the beat of a curated holiday playlist. In the evenings, cars slowed down to watch, their headlights lining the street as families pointed and took videos. Legally, the HOA couldn't say a word. It was December now, well within any reasonable holiday window. But their frustration was palpable. They knew I was making a point, and every glowing bulb was another reminder that their attempt to strong-arm me had backfired spectacularly. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about showing that their power had limits. And the best part? I was inspiring others. By mid-month, more houses on the block had their own over-the-top displays. Not everyone went to my level, but enough joined in that the street began to look more festive than it had in years. The HOA's iron grip on seasonal aesthetics was slipping, and there was nothing they could do about it. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. January was coming, and with it, the challenge of keeping the display alive year-round without giving them any foothold for a violation. That was when the real creativity would be tested. I had plans for that too. January arrived quietly in most of Maplewood. The last of the Christmas wreaths came down. Inflatable snowmen deflated and folded into storage bins, and the warm glow of holiday lights vanished from windows one by one. The neighborhood returned to its usual muted tones, all except for one house. Mine. The transition from December's grandeur to January's theme happened without a single night of darkness. One evening, my synchronized Christmas lights danced to carols. By the next, they pulsed softly to the colors of winter frost, pale blues, silvers, and white. I replaced the nutcrackers with elegant arrangements of bare birch branches dusted with glitter, set in tall planters by the door. Snowflake projections drifted lazily across the siding, and a shimmering ice blue wreath replaced the one that had been adorned with pine cones and holly. This wasn't holiday decor in the traditional sense. It was winter decor, seasonal, stylish, entirely outside the scope of any HOA holiday restrictions. My brother had reviewed the bylaws again and assured me I could keep it up as long as I liked, as long as I could argue it reflected the season rather than a specific holiday. Mrs. Lane, of course, saw it differently. The first week of January brought yet another letter, this time accusing me of extending holiday displays beyond the reasonable period. She used phrases like neighborhood character and visual fatigue, as if my lights were some form of pollution. The problem was, she still couldn't point to a single bylaw that I had violated. I added the letter to my growing collection, the folder now thick enough to stand upright on its own. The stack was becoming almost symbolic, a record of every attempt they'd made to control something that wasn't theirs to control. By mid-January, the display had drawn more attention than ever. A local lifestyle blog wrote a follow-up piece on the house that refuses to go dark, praising the creativity of year-round decorations and framing it as a new trend that brought visitors from outside the neighborhood, driving slowly down Maplewood Lane just to see what I'd done next. Kids rolled down their car windows to watch the snowflake light spin. Couples stopped to take photos in front of the glowing porch. The increased attention seemed to irritate the HOA even more. A notice appeared on the community board reminding residents that traffic obstruction caused by attractions could result in penalties. It wasn't addressed to me by name, but the timing made the target obvious. And so February became my next opportunity. The winter blues faded into deep reds, blush pinks, and soft whites. Heart-shaped lanterns hung from the eaves, and a garland of roses, artificial but convincingly real, draped across the porch railing. The snowflake projections shifted into slow-falling pink petals, creating the illusion of a romantic snowfall. Valentine's Day arrived early on Maplewood Lane, and it stayed long after the 14th had passed. Each change brought a fresh wave of attention and, inevitably, another letter from Mrs. Lane. She claimed the decorations were disruptive and unseasonal, after their intended date. But again, the bylaws betrayed her. There was no clause stating how long seasonal decorations could remain. Her frustration was clear not just in the tone of the letters, but in her increasingly visible presence on the street, phone in hand, snapping photos like a private investigator documenting a crime scene. March brought green, shamrocks, gold coins in glass vases, and a cheerful leprechaun figure on the porch. The lights shifted again, now a soft emerald hue with gold accents. It wasn't gaudy. I had a decorator's touch, and I made sure each display felt deliberate, even artistic. Cars still came by to look, and neighbors who once stayed quiet about their distaste for the HOA began stopping to tell me they loved what I was doing. Some even started adding small touches to their own homes, a wreath here, a flag there. It was subtle rebellion, but it was rebellion all the same. That, more than anything, was what infuriated the HOA. This was no longer just about me. It was about control slipping through their fingers, about a single act of defiance spreading like a crack in glass. They could try to pressure me all they wanted, but the truth was spreading. They didn't have the authority they pretended to have. By the time April rolled around, I was already planning Phase 5. Spring flowers, Easter pastels, a porch that would look like it had bloomed straight out of a painting. But I also knew Mrs. Lane was preparing her own next move. She'd been too quiet lately, and that was rarely a good sign. Some battles are loud and obvious. Others are fought in silence until the moment they break. And I had a feeling this next one was going to be the loudest yet. By late April, the seasonal war had become a defining feature of life in Maplewood. My porch was now a riot of pastel tulips, faux cherry blossom branches, and garlands of tiny eggs in pale blues and pinks. A large wooden rabbit sat beside the front steps, painted with a glossy coat that caught the spring sunlight. The warm white fairy lights, the very ones that had started this feud, still traced the porch railings, now intertwined with ivy and lavender sprigs. Neighbors passed by with strollers and dogs, stopping to admire the new look. A few even brought friends from other neighborhoods to see the house that changes with the calendar. The display had become something of a local landmark, and I could sense the subtle shift in the community's attitude toward the HOA. The once untouchable authority now looked petty and heavy-handed, their rules bending under public scrutiny. But Mrs. Lane was not a woman who took humiliation lightly. She had spent months trying to force compliance, each attempt met with quiet, calculated defiance. The more she pushed, the more I found ways to sidestep her authority without ever breaking a rule. The letters had become more formal, more frequent, and far more desperate. She'd stopped hiding behind vague language and was now openly accusing me of willfully undermining the neighborhood's governance. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I found the envelope taped to my front door, the paper inside protected by a clear plastic sleeve. This one bore not just the HOA letterhead but the seal of their legal counsel. It was no longer a warning. It was a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action. They claimed my continuous decorative displays constituted a nuisance, that they disrupted neighborhood harmony and devalued nearby properties. It was the kind of language designed to intimidate, peppered with citations to bylaws that, when read closely, still didn't actually forbid what I was doing. But I knew this was their strategy, to escalate the fight into a setting where most people would fold rather than face the stress and cost of court. Unfortunately for them, I wasn't most people. My brother, ever the voice of calm strategy, reviewed the notice that evening. His verdict was swift. Their claims were weak, their cited bylaws vague, and their case more about posturing than substance. But if they wanted to take this to court, he was ready. He advised me to keep meticulous records, photographs of each seasonal display, receipts showing purchases clearly tied to each time of year, and, most importantly, the growing pile of HOA correspondence. The lawsuit was filed in early May. It wasn't a full trial yet, just a petition to the local court seeking an injunction to force me to remove my permanent display of seasonal decorations. They presented it as a matter of neighborhood integrity, claiming widespread complaints. What they didn't expect was the wave of residents who quietly reached out to me, offering support. Some had their own stories, fines over garden gnomes, warnings for unsightly bird feeders, demands to paint over perfectly acceptable door colors. They were tired of the petty enforcement, and they saw my case as a chance to push back. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the small county courtroom with my brother at my side and a binder thick with evidence. Mrs. Lane sat at the other table with the HOA's attorney, her expression sharp and unyielding. The judge, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, opened the proceedings with a simple request for both sides to state their positions. The HOA's lawyer painted a picture of chaos, a neighborhood overrun by constant spectacle, a homeowner disregarding community agreements, an association struggling to maintain order. Then it was our turn. My brother laid out the facts with surgical precision. The exact wording of the bylaws, the total absence of any explicit time limits on seasonal decor, the documented evidence showing how each display matched the corresponding month. He even produced a copy of the original guidelines from before the HOA's recent interpretation, showing that nothing I'd done could be considered a violation. The judge listened quietly, flipping through the evidence, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the pettiness of some of the HOA's complaints. The turning point came when my brother presented the photos, side-by-side comparisons of my displays with other homes in the neighborhood that had similar decorations at different times of year. The difference was that no one else had received so much as a warning. The pattern was obvious. This wasn't about rules. It was about one homeowner being singled out. When the judge finally spoke, his tone left little doubt. The HOA's request for an injunction was denied. Without a clear, enforceable rule against year-round seasonal decorations, they had no authority to demand their removal. The case, in his words, was a matter of personal taste, not legal standing. The ruling was a public blow to Mrs. Lane's authority. Word spread quickly, and for the first time in months, I didn't find a letter waiting for me the next morning. But the silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like regrouping. HOAs rarely admit defeat outright. They find other ways to press back, other rules to enforce, other avenues to reclaim control. And as much as I relished the victory, I knew the war wasn't over. If anything, it had just entered a new phase. One where the battles would be fought not in courtrooms, but in the daily undercurrents of neighborhood life. As October drew to a close, the neighborhood buzzed with a tension that was no longer about rules and penalties, but about curiosity and anticipation. Word had spread far beyond the gates of the HOA community, attracting people from other neighborhoods, nearby towns, and even local reporters eager to see the house that had become both a symbol of defiance and a spectacle of unrestrained holiday joy. By the time Halloween arrived, the homeowner's year-round holiday display had evolved into something almost magical. Twinkling Christmas lights wrapped every railing and tree branch, strands of orange and purple bulbs lined the driveway, and a massive glowing jack-o'-lantern grinned from the porch while snowflake projections danced across the walls. A mechanical reindeer stood beside a giant inflatable turkey, while Easter eggs peeked from the flower beds. In every corner, some symbol of a holiday, no matter how obscure, made its appearance. It was less a home and more a living, breathing calendar, where every season lived side by side in perpetual celebration. The HOA board could no longer pretend this was a simple violation of their rules. Their attempts at intimidation, the fines, the letters, the threats, had become laughable in the face of growing public interest. Each time they issued a warning, the homeowner countered with a legal letter, backed by the state's clear stance on holiday decorations and personal expression. The board, once so confident in its authority, now seemed trapped in a battle they had already lost but were too proud to abandon. Neighbors who once grumbled about the eyesore began to see it differently. Parents brought their children to take photos in front of the glowing house. Elderly residents stopped by just to sit in the driveway, sipping hot cocoa under the glow of 1,000 lights. Strangers left notes of support, thanking the homeowner for bringing joy to a neighborhood that had been smothered by rules and regulations. The display had become a community event, one not organized or sanctioned by the HOA, but by the simple act of someone refusing to back down. The local news ran a segment titled, "The House That Lit Up the HOA," and the footage captured the homeowner standing in front of the display, smiling under a Santa hat in late October. The interview was polite but pointed, highlighting how arbitrary rules can be challenged when backed by law. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The HOA, always hiding behind fine print and technicalities, was exposed as nothing more than a group of volunteers trying to control what they could not own. Winter rolled in, and with it, the full glory of the holiday season. Snow blanketed the lawn, making the lights sparkle even brighter. The mechanical reindeer now had company. A glowing menorah stood proudly by the garage, alongside a banner for New Year's Eve. Fireworks lit up the sky on December 31st, the homeowner hosting a block-wide celebration that drew more people than the HOA's official events ever had. By spring, the display remained. Easter brought pastel garlands and oversized eggs to join the mix. Summer followed with miniature flags, beach balls, and paper lanterns swaying in the warm breeze. Each season layered itself onto the last, until the house became a visual history of the battle that had once consumed the neighborhood. The HOA never officially admitted defeat. Instead, they quietly stopped sending letters, removed the "No Early Decorations" clause from their handbook, and turned their focus to other issues, anything that didn't risk another very public loss. For the homeowner, victory was not just about keeping the lights up. It was about proving that one person's determination could outshine the most stubborn opposition. Years later, people still drove by to see the house, even if the decorations had mellowed into a more cohesive display. The homeowner had moved on from the bitterness of the fight, but the lights remained as a reminder, to neighbors, to visitors, and most importantly, to the HOA, that rules meant to control joy rarely survive against those willing to protect it. And every October, as the air cooled and leaves turned, the house would glow just a little brighter. Not because it had to, but because it could. The lights, the colors, the cheer, they weren't just decorations anymore. They were a symbol, promise, that sometimes the most powerful way to win is simply to keep shining.